In the late 1970s, China was a nation the world barely noticed. A closed economy, a rural society, a country recovering from political chaos and economic isolation. Its factories were primitive, its cities were quiet, its exports were insignificant. And then, in 1978, something happened that would change global wealth, global power, and the global consumer economy forever. China opened its doors, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a strategic ambition the world did not yet understand. Deng Xiaoping, the architect of modern China, didn't promise democracy, he promised prosperity. He looked at the world and saw an opportunity no other leader saw. The West wanted cheap goods. China had cheap labor. The rest was inevitability. Factories began rising in places that had never seen industrial machines. Rural workers stormed into cities by the millions, forming the largest human migration in economic history. Entire regions transformed into manufacturing zones overnight. China wasn't building an economy. It was building a workshop for the planet. And it approached the task with cold, methodical precision. Special economic zones were carved out along the coast. Shenzhen, Xiamen, Zhuhai, Shantou. Experimental cities where foreign companies were welcomed. Taxes were slashed. Regulations were softened. And investment was protected. Western corporations poured in. American retailers poured in. European suppliers poured in. The world didn't see China as a rival. It saw China as a bargain. The place to produce toys, shoes, electronics, furniture, appliances, and anything else that could be manufactured faster and cheaper than anywhere else. But China had a deeper strategy. It didn't want to be a supplier of cheap goods forever. It wanted to master manufacturing. So the government built vast industrial parks, massive steel factories, power stations and ports, highways and rail networks, training programs for millions of workers. China wasn't reacting to globalization. It was engineering it. By the 1990s, the country had become an unstoppable force. By the 2000s, it became the global manufacturing center. By the 2010s, it became the core of every major supply chain on Earth. China didn't just join the world economy. It reshaped it. Consumers in the West paid less. Corporations earned more. Inflation stayed low. Profits soared, and the world became addicted to the new reality. Fast, cheap, Chinese-made. But behind the convenience was a transformation far larger. A shift that hollowed out foreign industries, reshaped trade routes, and created a dependency the world never intended. China had risen. The world's factory was built. And the next chapter would explain the engine behind it. Labor, cheap, abundant, controlled, and relentless. China didn't become the world's factory because of luck, or geography, or some mysterious cultural efficiency. It became the world's factory because it understood something every empire before it misunderstood. Global power isn't built on wealth. It's built on labor. And China had more labor than any nation in history. In the 1980s and 1990s, hundreds of millions of rural workers left their villages, not because they wanted to, but because the new economy demanded it. Entire provinces emptied as people poured into coastal cities, forming a workforce so vast, so cheap, and so disciplined that Western companies couldn't compete with it. They could only depend on it. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered. China controlled wages, controlled migration, and controlled opportunities. The Hukou household registration system locked workers into second-class status, ensuring they remained affordable. Factories could hire 5,000 workers overnight. Dorms could house 20,000. Shifts ran 24 hours, rotating like clockwork. Western companies had never seen labor like this. A workforce willing to work 6 days a week. 12-hour shifts. For wages that seemed impossibly low, sometimes less than $2 a day. But to Chinese workers, those wages were better than anything they had back home. The miracle wasn't exploitation. The miracle was scale. China didn't have millions of workers. It had hundreds of millions. And that scale reshaped the global economy. American factories couldn't compete, not with Chinese workers assembling electronics for 10% of the cost. European manufacturers couldn't compete, not with production zones that housed more workers than entire EU cities. Southeast Asia, India, even Mexico watched as their industries were swallowed alive by China's labor efficiency. It wasn't just cheap. It was organized. China built industrial towns around single products, supply chains within single provinces, ports dedicated to factory clusters, logistics networks built for speed, not comfort. A factory in Guangdong could get raw materials from Shanghai in a day and ship finished goods to Los Angeles in under 2 weeks. It was a machine, human-powered, government-coordinated, globally integrated. And every Western corporation lined up to use it. Walmart, Target, Nike, Adidas, Apple. All of them discovered the same truth. China could produce anything, faster and cheaper, at a scale the world had never seen. The result? Prices around the world collapsed. Consumers got the illusion of prosperity. Corporations captured record profits. Inflation stayed artificially low. Everyone celebrated China's rise because it made life cheaper. Nobody asked what would happen if the world became dependent on one nation for everything it bought, wore, held, or used. But that question would become impossible to avoid, because China wasn't done. Cheap labor was only the foundation. The real transformation would come from something even bigger: logistics, the arteries that made the world flow through China, and that story belongs to the next chapter. Cheap labor made China competitive, but logistics made China unbeatable. Because by the early 2000s, Beijing understood something the West had forgotten. The real power in global trade isn't manufacturing, it's movement. Moving goods faster, moving goods cheaper, moving goods more predictably than any competitor on Earth. And China reorganized its entire geography around that idea. The transformation started with ports. Not old, congested ports built in the 1800s, but modern, automated industrial giants built to swallow the world's cargo. Shanghai, Shenzhen, Ningbo-Zhoushan, Qingdao, Tianjin. China didn't build ports for cities. China built cities for ports. The port of Shanghai became the busiest seaport on the planet, moving more containers in a year than entire nations did in a decade. Cranes worked day and night. Shipping yards ran like military bases. Containers flowed with the speed of blood through a living machine. Then came highways. Not 2-lane roads, not aging infrastructure, but a nationwide, meticulously engineered system of expressways stretching more than 100,000 kilometers, the largest highway network in the world. A truck leaving a factory in Guangzhou could reach a port, a border, or a distant province without ever stopping. No delays, no bottlenecks, no unpredictability. While America debated infrastructure bills and Europe argued over regulations, China was paving entire regions in concrete. Then came rail. High-speed rail lines connected industrial hubs to coastal ports with surgical precision. Freight trains spanning kilometers carried electronics, furniture, machinery, and textiles across the country in hours, a speed Western logistics companies couldn't dream of matching. China built the world's first true supply chain state. Factories weren't isolated buildings. They were nodes in a national ecosystem, linked to suppliers, shipping giants, airports, warehouses, and distribution centers that operated with near-military coordination. Logistics became China's superpower. A toy produced in a factory in Zhejiang could be packaged, labeled, containerized, and shipped to California in days, not weeks. Electronics assembled at sunrise could be on a cargo plane by sunset. This wasn't efficiency. This was dominance. Meanwhile, Western companies realized a painful truth. China wasn't just making goods cheaper, it was making them move cheaper. U.S. ports were aging. European transport networks were fragmented. Developing nations lacked infrastructure. China didn't just beat them at manufacturing, it beat them at movement, the part of the economy they never thought to defend. And just when the world believed China's logistics miracle had peaked, Beijing revealed the final stage, the Belt and Road Initiative, a global logistics empire built outside China's borders, highways in Pakistan, ports in Sri Lanka, railroads in East Africa, shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean, logistics hubs. In Europe, China wasn't just connecting its own country, it was connecting the world to itself. Cheap labor built the addiction. Logistics made the addiction permanent. But the next chapter reveals the real cost of this transformation: how cheap goods quietly rewired Western economies, hollowing out industries and creating a dependency nobody saw coming. When China began flooding the world with cheap goods, most Western countries didn't see a threat. They saw a miracle. Prices dropped, shelves filled, inflation fell, corporations cheered, consumers celebrated. A shirt that once cost $40 now cost $8. A microwave that once cost $200 now cost $49. A TV that once cost a month's wages now cost a week's. The West believed it had discovered a loophole in capitalism, a way to enjoy endless consumption without paying the true cost. But behind this miracle was a trap. Because the moment Western consumers became addicted to cheap goods, Western industries began to die. Factories that had thrived for decades, steel mills, textile plants, electronics assembly lines, furniture workshops, suddenly found themselves competing with Chinese factories that paid a fraction of the wages and operated with a scale no Western state could match. And one by one, those factories collapsed. Entire towns in America's Midwest went silent. Manufacturing belts in Britain rusted. Workshops in France and Italy fought for survival. Germany held on longer, but even it felt the pressure. The West didn't lose a few industries. It lost capabilities. Once factories close, the supply chains break. Once supply chains break, the skills fade. Once the skills fade, the country becomes dependent, and dependence became the new economic reality. Consumers bought more than ever, but manufacturers produced less than ever. Countries outsourced everything: steel, electronics, machinery, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, medical supplies. Everyday items from clothing to toys made in China went from a rarity to the default. Western companies didn't fight China's rise. They embraced it. Nike designed, China produced. Apple engineered, China assembled. Walmart sold, China supplied. The profit margins were irresistible. Shareholders celebrated. CEOs were rewarded. Politicians took credit for low inflation. But something darker was happening beneath the surface. The West wasn't just importing goods. It was importing deflation, dependency, and deindustrialization. Jobs disappeared. Wages stagnated. Communities hollowed out. The middle class shrank. Economic inequality grew. And yet consumers didn't complain, because their houses were full of cheap products. This was the trap. China gave the West low prices, and the West gave China its industrial dominance. By the time Western leaders realized what had happened, China wasn't just the world's factory. It was the world's supplier of everything: electronics, machinery, rare earth minerals, medical supplies, solar panels, batteries, pharmaceutical ingredients. The West had traded independence for affordability, and China wasn't finished. Cheap goods were only phase one. Phase two was something far more powerful: a global dependency web so deep that nations would realize too late that almost nothing in their modern economies could function without China. And that story belongs to the next chapter. By the 2010s, something extraordinary and quietly terrifying had happened. The world woke up and realized it was dependent on China. Not a little dependent, not partially dependent, but systemically, structurally, and irreversibly dependent. And the most shocking part? Nobody had voted for it. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had even noticed it happening. The dependency wasn't just in stores or shopping malls. It wasn't just in clothing or toys or electronics. It was in everything. The modern world, its technologies, its medicines, its infrastructure, had been woven into a web China controlled. Take electronics. China didn't just assemble iPhones. It built the factories that built the machines that assembled the components that powered the world's electronics. From laptops to routers to motherboards, almost every step in the chain ran through China. Then, rare earth metals. 17 elements critical to everything from smartphones to fighter jets to electric cars. 90% of the world's supply, processed in China, then pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, vitamins, painkillers, basic medical ingredients. The West discovered that as much as 70 to 90% of its drug supply depended on Chinese factories. Then solar panels, then batteries, then EV components, then 5G telecom hardware, then industrial machinery, then chemicals. Piece by piece, industry by industry, China became the central supplier of the modern world. But dependency wasn't just physical, it was logistical. China built the ports other nations relied on. China built the ships that carried global cargo. China built the cranes used in foreign harbors. China built the shipping containers the world used. China built entire trade routes through the Belt and Road Initiative. Dependence wasn't a side effect, it was the strategy. Because once a nation depends on you for essential goods, you don't need to conquer it. It is already captive. And countries learned this the hard way. When a single Chinese factory shut down during the pandemic, entire global industries collapsed, from cars to smartphones to medical equipment. Automakers had to halt production because they were missing one $2 component manufactured in Shenzhen. Hospitals scrambled because a pharmaceutical ingredient produced in Wuhan disappeared from the global pipeline. This wasn't vulnerability, this was exposure. And governments realized for the first time the true scale of the dependency. If China stopped exporting tomorrow, the world would stop functioning tomorrow. This was China's quiet superpower. Not military might, not diplomacy, not ideology, but supply chain dominance. A form of power more subtle than armies, more stable than alliances, more effective than sanctions. A form of power no nation in history had ever achieved. But the system that made the world dependent also created a geopolitical fault line, a tension that would force nations to ask a question they had avoided. For decades, can the world escape China's grip? And what happens if it tries? The final chapter answers that question, and it does not have an easy ending. For 20 years, the world enjoyed the benefits of China's rise: cheap goods, low inflation, endless supply, predictable logistics. But dependencies don't stay invisible forever. And today, a quiet panic is spreading through the world's capitals, from Washington to Berlin, Tokyo to New Delhi, as nations confront the question they've avoided for decades. What happens if China stops supplying the world? Until recently, that question seemed hypothetical. Then came the trade wars, then sanctions, then supply shocks, then a pandemic that exposed how fragile the global system really was. Car factories shut down because of missing chips. Pharmacies ran out of basic medicines. Electronics became scarce. Shipping costs exploded. Inflation returned with a vengeance. For the first time, the world realized, this isn't interdependence. This is imbalance. And that imbalance pushed nations into survival mode. The United States launched massive reshoring plans, subsidies for chip factories, rare earth mining, domestic manufacturing. Europe poured billions into battery plants and pharmaceutical independence. Japan paid its companies to move factories out of China. India tried to become the next factory of the world. Mexico positioned itself as the West's nearshore alternative. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The one policymakers whisper behind closed doors. Replacing China is not easy. Replacing China is not fast. Replacing China might not be possible at all, because China isn't just cheap labor. It isn't just huge factories. It isn't just ports, roads, and logistics. It is an ecosystem, a dense, interconnected industrial universe built over 40 years, where suppliers, workers, engineers, shippers, and manufacturers exist in one synchronized machine. No other nation has this. Not India, not Vietnam, not Mexico, not Indonesia, not even the United States. These countries can take fragments of China's supply chain. None can recreate the whole thing. So the world is left with a paradox. Everyone wants to reduce dependence on China. But everyone still needs China, and Beijing knows it. That dependency gives China leverage in geopolitics, leverage over trade, diplomacy, sanctions, and global alliances. Slowdowns in Chinese factories can shake stock markets worldwide. Restrictions on rare earth exports can cripple foreign militaries. Disruptions in pharmaceutical exports can paralyze healthcare systems. This isn't a Cold War. It's a cold dependency. The world needs China's goods. China needs the world's markets. And both sides understand the cost of breaking the system. The future won't be about who wins or loses. It will be about who adapts. Automation will rewrite manufacturing. AI will change supply chains. Energy transitions will shift geopolitics. New alliances will reshape trade. But the shadow of China's industrial empire will remain. Because China didn't just give the world cheap goods. It rewired global expectations that everything should be fast, cheap, and always available. And once a society becomes addicted to convenience, breaking that addiction becomes the hardest task of all.